This is our fifth lesson discussing the evidence for the Bible, and starting with the last video, we began turning our attention to the development of the New Testament canon, specifically by talking about how the Da Vinci Code misrepresents the history and development of the New Testament as we now currently have it. But like I mentioned in that last video, no credible historian takes Dan Brown's claims in the Da Vinci Code as being historically authentic. And so what I want to do in today's video is I want to turn to the claims of Bart Ehrman, and we're going to address how he presents the New Testament and how I believe those are also very misleading. So let's get to it. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar who specializes in New Testament textual criticism, the historical Jesus, and the development of early Christianity. He's an absolutely brilliant guy to such a degree that one of his textual criticism books, The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration, was one of my assigned textbooks in seminary. He's a super smart guy, and so right off the bat, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this video, I do want to address the fact that while I will be criticizing Bart Ehrman, and while I will be questioning some of his motives and how he presents the development of the New Testament canon, I don't in any way want this to be an attack on his character. I do not know this guy. I have never sat down with him and have a conversation, but I have seen plenty of interviews with him. I have seen debates with him, and I have read plenty of his books, and that is mainly where my video today is coming from. That being said, I can't begin to tell you how many stories I've heard of people deconstructing from the Christian faith because they read one of Bart Ehrman's books. Despite growing up as a born-again evangelical, he now identifies as an agnostic atheist, and his books reflect those atheistic beliefs, revolving around alleged contradictions in the Bible, the supposed elevation of Jesus to God's status well after the closing of the canon, etc. It's no wonder why, when people read his books, they are quick to lose heart. It seems like he is the go-to author for new atheists of Christians on the path to apostasy. Growing up, I always found myself intimidated by Ehrman's books precisely for this reason. If such a brilliant man like him could be swayed from the faith, what would keep me from doing the exact same thing? I had no problem engaging with stuff like the Da Vinci Code because the history was so laughably stupid. And Ehrman himself wrote a book called Truth and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code, where he addresses many of the same things that we discussed in our previous video. But as time passed, I realized that being an ostrich with your head stuck in the sand was no way to live the Christian life. If we believe ourselves to be on the side of truth, we shouldn't be afraid to engage with other people's arguments. We shouldn't be afraid to engage with the best arguments the opposing side has to offer on that note. For this reason, I started reading a bunch of Ehrman's books, taking copious details and notes on what I found as I read through the books. And this is where I arrive at a key detail. While Ehrman's books dealing with supposed Bible contradictions are fairly weak, in my opinion, doing a disservice to the text of Scripture, and built on the presupposition that the authors of Scripture were all uneducated simpletons incapable of nuance, his arguments dealing with the history and development of Christianity was actually far more complex. This was especially true in regard to the development of the New Testament canon. You see, while Dan Brown's version of Christianity, and Christian history in particular, was fused with outright lies, the same couldn't be said of Ehrman's works as I read them. Instead, almost everything he said was true on a technical level. However, they were presented in ways that, in my opinion, were intentionally and are intentionally misleading. On a personal note, this is frustrating to me precisely because I have so much respect for Ehrman as a person. He's a brilliant guy who knows what he's doing, so it frustrates me to see how he subtly mischaracterizes church history and how most of his mischaracterization is blinded by his own biases and his preconceived convictions and conclusions, which we're going to address in this video. For this reason, I found it relevant to examine some of Ehrman's claims as we discuss how we didn't get the New Testament. In his book, Misquoting Jesus, The Story Behind Who Changed the Bible and Why, Ehrman is addressing the various theological disputes plaguing the church in the early few centuries. As he details the diversity of theological convictions among early sects identifying themselves as Christian, Ehrman poses the following question. Why didn't these other Christian groups simply read their New Testaments to see that their views were wrong? It is because there was no New Testament. To be sure, all the books of the New Testament had been written by this time, but there were lots of other books as well, also claiming to be by Jesus' own apostles. Other Gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypses having very different perspectives from those found in the books that eventually came to be called the New Testament. Only one group eventually, quote, won out in these debates. It was this group that decided what Christian creeds would be. The creeds would affirm that there is only one God, the Creator. that Jesus' Son is both human and divine, and that salvation came by his death and resurrection. A little further on, he says, the group that established itself as, quote, orthodox, meaning that it held what is considered to be, quote, the right belief, then determined what future Christian generations would believe and read as Scripture. So, in general, like I said, I've read several of Ehrman's books, and I could highlight stuff in all of them, but I wanted to highlight these particular quotes right here because I think there are 5 things that Bart Ehrman does in just this short little quote right here that should give Christians pause, and should just give anybody pause, because I think that what he's doing is, to be frank, very, very, very misleading. And so what I want to do over the course of today's video is I just want to break down 5 different things that Ehrman does in this little quote right here that highlights how he is misrepresenting Christian history. And as much as I hate to say this, I think that he's doing it intentionally so. And if it's unintentional, it's simply because I believe he is being blinded by his biases, which once again is what we're going to address today. And so let's walk through this and let's talk about the various different things that Ehrman does that I think are misleading. Firstly, Ehrman claims that the reason early Christians couldn't reference the New Testament is, quote, because there was no New Testament, end quote. This technically is true. The earliest complete New Testament that we have is Codex Sinaiticus, dating to the mid-4th century. While we have canon lists predating this, we have no evidence directly confirming a precise date when the canon came to its final form. What Ehrman fails to mention is that the preponderance of evidence suggests that most of the New Testament texts were adopted immediately upon reception, and that all because, quote, there was no New Testament, end quote, in the sense of the exclusive canon, that is, the 27 books collected into a single formalized list, doesn't mean that there weren't books already functioning as canonical within early Christian communities. This is where our 3 definitions of canon that we've talked about over the course of the last several weeks come into play. As an agnostic atheist, Ehrman does not believe in a natural canon. Since he presupposes that there is no God, he also presupposes that none of the documents could have actually been inspired by God. When discussing a religious text, one must at least presuppose the plausibility of its authenticity, but Ehrman doesn't do so, which means that every time he uses the word canon, he means something different than we do. From his perspective, canonicity does not refer to the works God actually inspired, but rather the works which man arbitrarily chose, and this is important to remember. In fact, this is something that Ehrman does quite often. Even whenever it comes to discussing the resurrection of Jesus, he readily admits that he finds any other possible conclusion more reasonable than the resurrection because he presupposes that miracles cannot occur. But as a historian, this is not how you can actually approach a situation. If you're approaching a situation, or if you're approaching a theory or claim that a central aspect to that claim is that it is supernatural in origin, you have to at least allow for the possibility that supernatural or miraculous occurrences can actually take place. If you rule those out from the beginning, then that's going to blind your conclusions, and that's going to sway where you ultimately arrive at, and that's what Ehrman does. Because he does not believe that God exists, he does not allow for the possibility that these books actually could be inspired by God, and therefore, from his perspective, the church cannot identify a canon, they can only create a canon. And therefore, the natural canon does not matter to him, the functional canon does not matter to him, the only thing he cares about is the exclusive canon, because he believes that the canon was arbitrarily chosen by people centuries after the fact. And that is because his worldview is blinding him, or not necessarily blinding him, it is giving him a presuppositional bias, right? Where he is arriving at his conclusion before he's actually examined the evidence itself, and he is presupposing that the canon has to be man-made. All right, secondly, Ehrman claims that, quote, there were lots of other books as well, also claiming to be by Jesus' own apostles, other gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypses having very different perspectives from those found in the books that eventually came to be called the New Testament, end quote. This, technically, is also true. What Ehrman fails to mention is that all of these, quote, other books date to the 2nd century or later, over 100 years after the ministry of Jesus Christ. Regardless of whether or not these books claim to, quote, be by Jesus' own apostles, end quote, we know that they couldn't actually be written by them because the apostles were already well dead by this point. By contrast, every book in our New Testament was written in the 1st century, while the apostles and their disciples were alive to validate the teachings as authentic. Ehrman mentions that these other books have, quote, very different perspectives, end quote, from those found in the New Testament, which is also true. However, what he doesn't mention is that these other perspectives are often very, very strange, including stories such as dragons coming out of a cave to bow before the baby Jesus, the boy Jesus killing his childhood friend only to resurrect him, stretching out a piece of wood to help out his adopted father Joseph after Joseph accidentally cuts a board too short, or the cross itself following Jesus outside of the empty tomb, accompanied by giant angels whose heads reach into the clouds, and also Jesus instructing Mary Magdalene to become a male if she wants to be saved. They are other perspectives, all right, just like Ehrman claims, but not all perspectives are equally valid or credible. These books do claim to be by Jesus' apostles, but unlike the books which are actually in our New Testaments, there is no evidence suggesting that they actually were by Jesus' apostles, nor that there was any reason to actually take them seriously. And so once again, what Ehrman says is technically true, but he doesn't clarify. He doesn't offer the clarification that even though these claim to be by apostles, there is literally no possible way they were actually by apostles, right? And while he does say that they offer different perspectives, he doesn't go on to clarify what those perspectives were. There's a very clear reason why these books were rejected. They were not apostolic, and even if they were from the right time period, they're just very, very, very strange books. All you have to do is go look them up and read them. We have access to these books, and I would encourage you, go check them out. In future videos, we're going to address some of these books just to highlight how clearly inauthentic they actually are. Thirdly, Ehrman claims that, quote, only one group eventually, quote, won out in these debates, end quote. This, technically, is also true. But I want you to notice how he felt the need to put the words won out in quotation marks. This, to me, is evidence that Ehrman knows that he is being deceiving, because he knows that winning out is not the accurate way of categorizing which books made it into the New Testament. He would have us believe that the church fathers were duking it out to get their favorite books into the Bible, but there is no evidence of such a thing ever occurring. Rather, there is the documented acknowledgement that as time passed, books fell into one of three categories: acknowledged, disputed, or rejected. We have no evidence of the disputed books being debated about. Instead, the Christians merely acknowledged that they were still trying to figure out what to do about those ones, and these are things we're going to talk about once again over the course of the next several weeks when we look at the original evidence. Far from having a nefarious motive, the historical evidence suggests that the only agenda motivating the church fathers was a quest for truth. They wanted to know which books were actually God-breathed, no more, no less. Eventually, the 27-book consensus was ironed out, but we have no evidence that this arose from some vicious debate where one group had to, quote, win out. That is an unfair characterization which attempts to Dan Brownify Christian history by cloaking it with hints of conspiracy. And this, again, is where you begin to see, I think that Ehrman has ulterior motives here, right? Because he's a smart guy, and I think that's what makes it so dangerous about what he's saying here. Because Ehrman, like Dan Brown, again, what we talked about last time, nobody takes Dan Brown's claims seriously. Bart Ehrman wrote a book about how silly Dan Brown's claims are. But Ehrman himself is a smart guy, and many people do take him seriously, and he's smart enough to know that this is not a proper way to characterize the history of Scripture and the history of how the canon came to be, and that's why he has to even put the words "won out" in quotation marks, because he knows that's not a fair representation, right? There's a reason why these books were chosen, and it wasn't because of some vicious debate. Fourthly, Ehrman claims that, quote, it was this group that decided what Christian creeds would be, end quote. This is kind of true. It is true that our first complete collection of the New Testament canon, Codex Sinaiticus, dating to the mid-4th century AD, comes from around the same time as famous creeds like the Nicene Creed were being produced. However, while Codex Sinaiticus is the first complete New Testament discovered, it's doubtful that it was the first one that ever existed, because that would just suggest that we happened to find the first one that ever existed. Furthermore, Codex Sinaiticus was found at St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, whereas the Council of Nicaea was held in modern-day Turkey. So there's no direct relationship, which would suggest that, quote, the group who finalized the Bible decided what the Christian creeds would be. Further, he acts as if these creeds popped up out of nowhere, whereas in reality, the New Testament documents were themselves filled with early Christian creeds, such as in Philippians or in 1 Corinthians. And even the creeds created by the early church were built upon centuries of study and interpretation of the New Testament texts. In other words, the creeds could only be created because those texts had been functioning as canonical for so long. This, again, is where Ehrman displays his bias. Since he does not believe that there is a God, he does not care about the natural or functional definitions of canon. He does not believe God inspired the texts, and therefore he does not care about the organic process of the church recognizing these documents over time. Instead, he only cares about the finalized list, the exclusive canon, and therefore he can claim that whoever, quote, decided upon the canon also, quote, decided upon the creeds. This is only true if you presuppose that the texts are not inspired. If God did inspire the texts, then it was God who decided the canon and God who decided the creeds, while the church was given the responsibility of identifying the canon and thus formulating the creeds which reflected that canon, a process which took time until arriving at an exclusive final list. So again, Ehrman's words are technically true, but only if one presupposes that the New Testament documents are nothing more than human inventions and the church is nothing more than an agenda-driven conspiracy. Otherwise, his words are misleading, and it is his own worldview that is shaping the conclusions he arrives at. And the issue is that he doesn't flat out explain all these things in the book itself. He presents his story as the definitive story because he views his worldview as the only legitimate worldview. He does not believe in God, and therefore he doesn't think anybody should believe in God, and therefore he thinks that all of us should only accept the story that presupposes a God does not exist. Fifthly and finally, Ehrman claims that the group that established itself as, quote, orthodox, meaning that it held what is considered to be the, quote, right belief, then determined what future Christian generations would believe and read as scripture, end quote. This, once again, is technically true. Yet notice once again how Ehrman placed the word orthodox in quotation marks. He speaks of orthodox as if it is an arbitrary title that that only one group can merely establish, or let me rephrase that. Ehrman places the word orthodox in quotes because he is speaking of orthodox as simply an arbitrary title that a group can establish itself as, right? That's what he says. It established itself as orthodox, which again is only true if one presupposes that there is no God. If there is a God, and if that God did inspire works of the Bible, and he did inspire the books themselves of the Bible, then orthodoxy is a very real thing. Ehrman's parenthetic explanation of orthodoxy, however, again demonstrates his bias. Rather than explaining that etymologically speaking, the word orthodoxy means right belief, he asserts that the title refers to that which is merely considered to be the right belief, which once again presupposes that there is no ultimate standard to which it must be compared. Since Ehrman is agnostic, he does not think there are genuine right beliefs of Christianity, and therefore he does not believe that there is a legitimate orthodoxy by which all things must be compared. Therefore, from his agnostic perspective, orthodoxy is not a God-given standard to be discovered by man, but an arbitrary man-made fiction established by those in power and imposed on the losers. His theological convictions inherently shape how he presents the formation of the New Testament text, but his lack of clarity in conveying this conveys to those who read his work that this is the unbiased real account of how the New Testament canon came to be, in spite of the fact that it is entirely speculative, unevidenced, and contrary to the history that we do actually have. Given the fact that he is a compelling writer and an intelligent guy with a huge following and shining credentials, the casual and uninformed reader will accept his words as gospel truth when in reality they are themselves an alternate version of history shaped by preconceived yet unacknowledged biases. Back to the point at hand, while Ehrman's statement here is true, what he didn't mention was how the Orthodox group was established. He would have his readers think that the formation of the New Testament canon and the development of the creeds that followed was an arbitrary matter decided upon by a bunch of old men in a smoky room. But he doesn't mention how, in reality, the canon was identified based on apostolic authority. In other words, books weren't picked at random, but were identified on the basis of apostolic authority, which is what we're going to be talking about again over the course of the next several weeks. The reason the, quote, other books were rejected is because they weren't written by the apostolic community, or with apostolic approval. The reason the book of the New Testament were accepted was because they were written by the apostles and their closest associates. This is far from the arbitrary eeny, meeny, miny, mo that Ehrman would have us believe. It wasn't merely a matter of picking and choosing. When historians are trying to determine historical truth, they prefer to find the earliest testimonies possible, and that's exactly what the New Testament documents are. Assuming that there was a historical Jesus, who is better equipped and more likely to produce an accurate, authoritative account on his life, mission, and values? People writing centuries after the fact, or people who knew Jesus best, eyewitnesses who were, according to the earliest witnesses and traditions, handpicked to be his authoritative ambassadors to the nations. From this perspective, Orthodox Christian teaching is established by Jesus and entrusted to his disciples, and the authenticity of a New Testament text hinges not on one's arbitrary decision, but on its apostolicity. Though Ehrman presents himself as a historian, he breaks the basic rules of historiography by acting as if all witnesses are equally reliable, fabricating an unevidenced narrative of equally credible sects competing with one another until one arbitrarily defeats the other. And I can already anticipate how some people might respond. One might argue that my conclusions are just as biased as Ehrman's, but the key difference is that I am willing to consider the history from both angles, the divine and the human, in order to see which one history sufficiently backs up. Ehrman elsewhere readily admits that his historical investigation presupposes that God does not exist. Yet he fails to acknowledge throughout his books how this presupposition shapes the presentation of his arguments. For this reason, people read his books and they think they are reading unbiased history, where in reality they are reading history intentionally filtered through a naturalistic lens. It is an unfair representation of Christianity, and it violates core principles of historiography by willfully allowing one's horizons to shape one's conclusions. When dealing with the historical record of a supposed supernatural text, you have to at least allow for the possibility that the text is in fact supernatural, and Ehrman does not do this. My goal whenever I approach this is to examine things from both angles and to look and figure out which one the evidence actually backs up. And whenever you look at it, the evidence actually supports the supernatural backbone of it, to where there is no evidence for the things that Ehrman is claiming. He is trying to present it like there was this agenda, but that is all speculative and there's no evidence behind any of this. In the end, we can say this. Ehrman's errors are not that he is muttering outright falsehoods. Rather, his chief errors lie in the fact that he is teaching truths in intentionally misleading ways, characterizing the development of the New Testament church in the worst possible light as a rhetorical strategy to arouse skepticism and disbelief. His books offer an alternate view of history shaped by personal biases and presuppositions, but he presents them as if they are the definitive history, which should be obvious to everyone, though in many cases they are speculative and contrary to the actual historical evidence that we have. If you were to ask Ehrman for clarification, or if I were to mention all these details directly to his face, I imagine that he would readily concede that technically everything I've said in this video is true. And that is precisely why his works, I think, are actually so dangerous. Ehrman is a smart, well-educated, thoughtful guy who really knows his stuff, yet he purposefully abridges the truth in order to frame history in the worst possible light. Every argument he makes is built on a presupposition of naturalism, but he is such a compelling author, and he speaks with such absolute certainty that the reader is left with the impression that his books are unbiased and definitively true accounts. What I've shared with you is but a short quote from a few pages in one of his books, but every one of his books that I've read are filled with the same sort of stuff. Ehrman can at once write books criticizing Dan Brown's history as presented in the Da Vinci Code, while at the very same time proposing his own alternate view of history that is just as conspiratorial and unevidenced as Brown's own, with the exception that Ehrman is smart enough to formulate his version in such a way to ring with a modicum of truth. If someone who isn't equally as studied doesn't come along to point out the rhetorical misdirects, his words will succeed in planting doubts in even the most pious of Christians, who will be left with the impression that the church has been lying to them their entire lives. And that is going to bring this video to a close. There are plenty of other ways that we didn't get the New Testament out there. I'm not going to address all of them. I just wanted to address the Da Vinci Code, which I view as very uncredible, and then I wanted to address Bart Ehrman, who I view as a credible source, and I want to address both of those, but starting next time, we are going to come back and we're going to actually begin talking about how we got the New Testament. Until then, my name's David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face, don't let anybody steal your joy, and remember who you are, and of course, Maranatha. See y'all later.